I'm honored to be here and to have the opportunity to share a little bit about my work as an educator and a researcher of the Romani Holocaust. Before I sort of launch into the presentation, one thing I forgot to mention in the bio is that I've recently joined the IRA, the U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and some of the information that you'll see is things that I've gathered through that experience in the last year. Um, and the other thing that I kind of wanted to kick things off with was with a more personal account of how I began thinking about or researching the Romani genocide, which dovetails a little bit with how I'm going to talk about historical lacunae and the lack of representation of Roma in Holocaust narratives. But the reason that I actually started researching the Romani genocide is that when I went to Romania for the first time, as Emma mentioned, I was raised in Portland, Oregon. So I was a child of two Romani people from Romania, but I was raised in Oregon. And I went to Romania for the first time, and despite a sort of robust Holocaust education that I received in the US, that started from a young age, I wasn't aware of the fact that Roma had been persecuted in the Holocaust until I was invited to attend the 75th anniversary of the liquidation of the Zigeunerlager in Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was the 75th anniversary in 2014, and I happened to be in Romania at the time, and one of the organizations that I was working with invited me to attend. And to that point, I hadn't really been aware of the atrocities that had been enacted towards my own people. And that started me on this path of trying to understand not only the history, so becoming a student of history and really learning about what happened, but also understanding why what happened became so unknown, as is often the sort of epithet that's accompanied with the Romani Holocaust is unknown, silenced. Like how was it that this genocide was so unknown? And I think the presentation today gets at some of those questions and sort of thinking about how historical trauma gets remembered or not remembered. And I think some of it will overlap a little bit with what Carola talked about in the previous session. And then we'll get to th be thinking about what Roma people themselves have done to sort of keep that memory alive, and especially more in recent years, but also in post-war Europe. What have Roma done to sort of cultivate Romani memory or even re-memory of the Holocaust in the wake of all of this forgetting that I too was sort of victim to. So let me share my screen now with that sort of mini introduction, and we can get into it. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to do is define what we mean by historical trauma. What is it? Why does it matter? And as I'm sort of discussing the historical origins of the term and sort of how it's used, I've just put these questions on the board for you to reflect on, who you are, why you're here, why does historical or what does historical trauma mean, and why does it matter to you? What does it mean to you? As you're thinking through the Romani Holocaust. Historical trauma, or it's sometimes called collective trauma, is a term that was a sort of neologism um, that has its origins really in Native American studies. Um, and it's kind of in the 80s when this term pops up, and it's used by a woman named Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, who first coined the term in the 80s in her study of Native American boarding schools in the United States during the mid 17th and early 20th century. So the term refers to kind of as a definition, the cumulative emotional harm of an individual or generation caused by a traumatic experience or event. And in most cases, but not all, it's used to refer to trauma inflicted on a particular racial or ethnic group. So things like the transatlantic slave trade, the Holocaust, the trauma, the historical trauma of colonization, relocation, forced assimilation. These are all examples of things that we can analyze or talk about through the lens of historical trauma. Um, this framework is very broad ranging, and it within the kind of discourse of historical trauma, it can be a sort of catch-all that allows us to talk about material, social, and economic ramifications, as well as even things like spiritual after effects of racialized persecution. How did it affect a sort of identity formation of that persecuted group? One of the things I wanted to emphasize is also the kind of historicity, the history element of the or the temporal element of this term, that it's enduring and unbounded. So when we talk about trauma, much of the time we think of it as a discrete event, something that happened, and then there's things like post-traumatic stress disorder, or there's this psychologizing or pathologizing of trauma in such a way that there's this one discrete event that needs to be processed and dealt with. Um, Unlike that understanding, that sort of medical understanding of trauma, when we think of collective trauma or historical trauma, this is historically or temporally unbounded. Um, as I'm sure you talked about with Julius and with Carola today, part of what scholars of the Romani Holocaust are often really invested in demonstrating is that the the core kind of historical trauma of the Roma is the fact that they were racialized from the moment they stepped foot on new territory in Europe as a diasporic people. And so the racialization is the sort of broad umbrella under which these discrete manifestations of traumatic persecution are they're kind of symptomatic of this larger cause. And the idea of historical trauma being temporally unbounded is important because it also allows us to talk about why it still matters. So, in activist discourse and in scholarly discourse, being able to have a way of talking about how something that happened in the past continues to resonate today, because of the effects of historical trauma on the persecuted group. And we'll get to some of that near the end of the presentation of how these things are, continuing to appear today in today's world. Again, this might be a little bit of redundant with what you talked about with Julius, but I think it's important to emphasize that when we are thinking about historical trauma, when it comes to the Roma, we're talking about hundreds of years of persecution, of which the Romani Holocaust is sort of the apex of, but that it's part of a larger experience of persecution within the European continent. So, as a diasporic group who migrated from northern India some 1,000 years ago, Romani people have endured a long history of persecution. And so I've just given a sort of overview of what that's looked like. Racialization, 500 years of enslavement in the Romanian principalities, obviously genocide during the Holocaust that we're talking about today, but ongoing discrimination that came in the forms of policies that restricted Romani movement, that tried to forcibly settle nomadic Roma, or policies that exiled Roma from particular countries and territories. Um, One thing that I would love for everyone to take away from this presentation is that the interpolation of Romani life, so the way that Roma were integrated into the kind of social and economic fabric of Europe, um, they that has always been dictated as a Romani status that served as a negative referent for European whiteness. And to put that more simply, essentially what I'm saying is that the idea of a white European was forged as a contrast to all of Europe's racialized others. And a big part of that sort of epistemological construction of whiteness within a European space had to do with Roma. Um, and again, during the Holocaust, this comes up. It's very much integral to thinking about, um, how to justify the the genocide of the Roma is through this biopolitical argument in which Roma are cut off from the category of a human, which in that period of time is considered to be a white European. Um, so the exclusion and persecution of Roma again served this epistemological project of creating whiteness, and it also just served nationalist projects more broadly. Um, And again, this idea of Roma being excluded from the category of the human and being racialized as other is the sort of original historical trauma. It's what underpins all manifestations of historical trauma that Roma endured over the centuries. And so this kind of original racialization begets all of the discrimination and persecution that Roma face. And that remains true today as well. Finally, I just want to think a little bit about intergenerational transmission and an impact. So, with all of that sort of background on what historical trauma has meant for the Roma, we can think about the kind of impacts that historical trauma have had on the Roma community. So, these things come in the form of health outcomes, poverty, segregation, this long continuum of what Black Studies scholar Christina Sharp calls the disaster. So, if the disaster is that racialization of Roma that begets centuries of racism, then we can trace this kind of red thread of trauma throughout the Roma's time as a diasporic population. And this is how this kind of transmission of intergenerational trauma occurs. It's through these kind of afterlives of trauma. Um, so again, these discrete traumatic events like the Holocaust, this is not something that's temporally bound to, the dates that we read about when World War II happened. Rather, they have these enduring effects that the trauma, essentially what I'm saying, the trauma doesn't end when the discrete traumatic moment ends, right? There's this afterlife of trauma. Okay. Um, so some of the repercussions of historical trauma often have to do with a lack of redress for past historical trauma. So again, as I've sort of been mapping out, you have the original wound, which in this case is genocide, but then there's no recourse or no redress in the form of compensation, of formal apologies that would allow that wound, that original wound, to begin to heal. And that begets more hurt and more trauma. And so I really like this quote from Bell Hooks from an essay or a chapter called Representing Whiteness, in which she's quoting another author, Itabari Njeri, who talks about the next thing we're sort of going to get into, which is this lack of redress or this lack of recognition. So she writes that one must face a palimpsest of written histories that erase and deny, that reinvent the past to make the present vision of racial harmony and pluralism more plausible. To bear the burden of memory, one must be willing to journey to places long uninhabited, searching the debris of history for traces of the unforgettable, all knowledge of which has been suppressed. And then she quotes Nijeri, who laments that nobody really knows us. So institutionalized is the ignorance of our history, our culture, our everyday existence that often we do not even know ourselves. And so you can imagine that when I read this after having been cut off from knowledge of my own people's historical trauma, that this really resonated, right? This idea that our trauma is so institutionalized, the forgetting of our trauma, the ignorance of our trauma is so institutionalized that we do not even know ourselves. Um, so I guess where this leads me is to this conclusion that why, if one is to ask why is memory of historical trauma important? Why does historical trauma matter and knowledge of historical trauma matter? Because it is a way of knowing ourselves, right? This kind of profound statement that the erasure of history, culture, and being results in this unknowing of self, right? Um, I want now to kind of think a little bit about like the mechanisms, right, through which it has been possible that this kind of institutionalized ignorance is something that now we're really working to undo, right? Probably in the last 10 years, um, this has been this sort of main project, right? There's a longer history to that, but as somebody who's been working on this for over a decade, it does feel like we're picking up steam in terms of undoing some of this institutionalized ignorance with regard to the Romani Holocaust. Um, the other just big takeaway point from this that I want to make sure I'm underlining is um, that in order for historical trauma to even begin to heal, that recognition is extremely important. So recognition of historical trauma, and we can talk a little bit about what that means in a moment, but that recognition is a key aspect of the possibility of healing from historical trauma. Um, the other thing that I like about this quote that I'll tease out now is this idea of the institution, right? The institutionalization of ignorance. And I think that that really hones in on, who is responsible for the lacunae in historical narratives. So it's not a sort of amorphous forgetting about the Romani Holocaust, but it is the word institution sort of implicates the state or museums or other kinds of institutions with power that hold a responsibility to address the repercussions of state violence. Um, and it also, I think, gets at this level of of writing history, right? And the sort of historiographic endeavor and the gaps and lacunae in hegemonic history that don't pay Roma enough attention in sort of incorporating Roma into global narratives and into historiographic sources, and therefore their trauma is unwritten. And again, in being unwritten, it's not recognized. I wanted to include too a Romani voice. So this is from thinking about teaching and learning about the persecution of Roma during the Nazi era. This is a document that Ira, I'm sure Carola mentioned and you're all aware of already. This is a document that Ira put together in the last years, which is recommendations for teaching and learning about the Romani Holocaust. It's excellent. I've used it myself, and I highly recommend it. And this is just an excerpt from that of a Romani person from Canada who writes this quote that resonates very much with Bell Hooks's quote. They say, throughout my 15 years of public school education, I was never once educated about the Roma experience during the Holocaust. If not for my grandmother sharing her family stories, particularly about her sister who endured medical experimentation, I would never have known about this tragedy. I want to see our stories included in Holocaust education throughout my country and internationally. So this resonates not only with bell hooks, but also with my own experience that I started the session with. And I think it underscores once again this lack of institutionalized historical knowledge, not of Romani memory, right, which exists in this embodied transmission of memory within the family, but a lack of historical knowledge within the institutions that we consider the sort of harbingers of historical knowledge, museums, and educational systems. Again, as I'm sure you've already talked about in this workshop, there's a very long history of uh, struggles for recognition. So there's a very long history of Sinti and Roma asking to be represented in mainstream commemorations of the Holocaust and being denied. I can speak from personal experience in when I was living in Romania during the fieldwork portion of my dissertation work. I was there in 2019 when Roma were excluded from a commemoration event on International Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th. Um, Roma, there at the time there were a handful of Romani survivors who could have been invited to participate at the event. Um, they were not invited, but and therefore they were not decorated by the president at the time, Klaus Johannes, alongside survivors of Jewish descent. So this is a local manifestation that I'm sharing with you of a global tendency to neglect and forget the Roma in Holocaust discourse, in the writing of the history of the Holocaust, and in commemorations like this one. Um, we can think about what are other forms of commemorations. I've mentioned museums, I've mentioned memorials, and these, respond directly to this need for recognition of the Romani Holocaust. Again, turning to the example of Bucharest, which is where I do my work, there was a Holocaust memorial unveiled in October of 2019 of 2009, excuse me. Um, and there's some discussion recently of an initiative to establish a Holocaust museum, but I haven't seen much since the announcement. Um, and the memorial, which I do have a photo of here, let me uh,
I
zoom
guess it
forward for a minute. This is the Holocaust memorial that I'm describing. The portion that's dedicated to the Roma is this wheel that's a sort of allusion to the Romani flag that is placed off to the side from the larger memorial commemorating the Jewish Holocaust. Um, and that is quite typical of sort of the way, not only physically in space, that Roma Holocaust memory has been sort of marginalized, um, but also in language and the sort of descriptions that accompany Holocaust museums and memorials. Roma are always seen as a sort of um, periphery victim group. So, for example, at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, in the signage when you enter the permanent exhibit, the Holocaust is defined as the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its allies and collaborators, and then places Roma into a secondary category of other victim groups. So this is very common in memorials and in museums across the world. Um, I want to read this quote from Orrin Bach-Stier, that Holocaust memory matters because it's made to matter by and through cultural forms and institutions that mediate the Holocaust in the present day. And again, connecting this to the Bell Hooks quote about the need for institutions that mediate the Holocaust in the present day, right? So there's collective memory that exists sort of in this amorphous space, but then there are institutions that tap into that collective memory and bring it into mainstream historical narratives. And it's that sort of transition between collective memory and institutionalized memory that the Roma we're still working on. Um, and one thing that, we'll see as I sort of transition into looking at these spaces where Roma have been fostering their own memory of the Holocaust, um, is that there's this lack of a sort of framework, institutional, commemorative, educational, historiographic, the lack of these sort of institutional frameworks make it difficult for Romani memory to become part of societal and collective memory. Um, so to not sort of give it away, but one of the things that, I'm thinking about with the work that I do and the art that I'll present is how much these artistic representations and commemorations of the Roma Holocaust, how much can they really do without the support of powerful institutions? Because it's charging these folks with a lot of responsibility to carry the memory of an entire historical trauma and genocide of an entire people through these um, small initiatives and through these artistic works instead of considering them as part of a larger nexus um, that needs these powerful institutions support in order to really connect Romani memory to societal collective memory. Um, as I've mentioned, um, these things that I've listed, reconciliation, reparation, apologies, commemorations, memorials, museums, all of these can be sort of categorized as recognition, right? One thing that all victim groups, from the Rwandan genocide to the Armenian genocide, all of these um, groups seek one thing in their pathway to healing, and that is recognition. And that list is the form that the recognition can take. So getting into um, this strategies, thinking about strategies for healing, what have the Roma done? How helpful, how useful are these things? Um, One thing that I find really helpful is thinking about how this kind of widespread lack of historical awareness kind of feeds bigotry and discrimination of Roma today. So that's a sort of theme that we'll come back to. And the art, the music, the poetry that we're going to look at, and things we don't have time to look at, that these repertoires are essentially things that they're trying to combat that. They're trying to combat the ignorance that feeds bigotry and discrimination. And for me, thinking about music in particular, I've looked at music as a way of, as a historical source, as something that can undo the sort of uh, historical lacunae, or sort of fill, I guess, the gaps in the historiography by looking at these sources as sources not only of music, but as sources of oral history, as things that are vital to creating a fuller picture of what we mean by historical trauma like the Holocaust, and embracing voices that have otherwise been missing from the historiography. So um, again, to kind of give away one of the big points, that the what we're going to get into, these are creations from Romani perspective. Um, and when you contrast that with what you see in the archive, you can tell a very different story about what that traumatic experience was like for the Roma. So that's what's really special about these representations and these pieces of art, is that they come from a Romani perspective, and we don't have access to that kind of Romani subjectivity in the archive, which is a perpetrator's archive. Um, I'm gonna skip this because I'm looking at the time, and get into some more of these examples now. Before I do, I do want to just mention this quote um, from Trio, because I think it dovetails so beautifully with Orrin Bach-Stier's kind of explanation of the institutionalization um, uh, that helps Holocaust memory matter. So this is a quote from Michel Rolfe-Trio from his book Silencing the Past. And he says, silences enter the process of historical production at four crucial moments: the moment of fact creation, the moment of fact assembly, the moment of fact retrieval, and the moment of retrospective significance, the making of history in the final instance. And I think that last one is really important, right? Because I think if we think about where Roma are in terms of this sort of four crucial moments of trios, we've been making sources, we've been making archives, and making narratives, and I'm not saying our work is done in those regards yet, but we're also at this point of making it significant, of making it matter, right? Of writing history with a capital H in its final instance. Um, and I think that what we're about to look at is kind of an assemblage of all of these moments. That it's, looking at song as a making of sources. It's creating a repertoire that stands in for an archive, right? It's creating a narrative out of these things that we typically wouldn't consider historical sources. And then, the fact that we're teaching and learning and talking about things, making them matter. Okay. I'm going to, I think, skip some of this. This was about, again, more about the sort of representation. This is the panel that I was talking about with the permanent exhibit at USHMM, that talks about Roma and Sinti as gypsies and talks about them as other victim groups. So there's been work by Liliana Radonik, for example, who writes about the sort of hierarchy of visibility within Holocaust museums, memorials, and broadly history. Really interesting work, I highly recommend. These are examples of some museums, but I'm going to get into the Roma memory work part of this presentation now. So first, I'd like to mention I don't have a video of either of these productions because they're not available, but the article that my collaborator Sieve Lee and I wrote about two theatrical rememberings of the Romani Holocaust. There was a French play called Samudari Pen, which is one of the terms used for the Roma Holocaust, in case no one's mentioned that today. Samudari Pen, and then there was another piece of theater called Kali Trash, which in Romani means black fear. These are two plays that one, Samudari Pen was a French play, Kali Trash was a Romani language theater piece that relay the story of Romani experiences of the Holocaust in those two different geographic settings. This screenshot is from the Romanian Romani play Kali Trash. Both of these are historically specific, but also fictionalized instances of Romani trauma that connect to broader patterns of anti-Roma persecution, past and present. As I mentioned, kind of throughout, in the kind of face of this historiographic dispossession that I'm mentioning, in my research, I look at the ways that Roma have commemorated or contextualized trauma in song and in music. So I'm going to shift now to showing you a handful of Romani songs. We don't actually have very many documented that commemorate the Romani Holocaust. And so in the way that I think about and listen to these works, I'm really interested in how listening and how orality can work against the sort of politics of memory that I've been kind of trying to lay the landscape for, the politics of memory, the politics of archive, that have rendered Romani knowledge of the Holocaust inaudible. So how are these songs sort of working against that? So this first example is Auschwitz Katek in Kerbaro, which many of you might be familiar with already. And I'm going to play you a version sung by Dr. Petra Gelbart, who you all also might be familiar with, whose great aunt brought this song out of Auschwitz. So let's listen together.
I guess it was meant to be a testimony, and it really just describes in very raw detail what happened in Auschwitz and the conditions there. And it talks about hunger, it talks about beatings, it talks about rape at the end. My connection to this song is that some of my mother's family members who survived, and you know, I don't know if it was more than one or two people who came back from Auschwitz, but somebody did. I know my mom's aunt came back from Auschwitz, and so somebody brought back this song that they had, that somebody that we don't know had composed in Auschwitz. And so my grandmother sings it, my great aunt sings it. Auschwitz התהיכר baro Eide odoi beshem ropirano Eide beshel gondoline Te premande Poviste ere Kataruska balval purde Edem ropirano ushman mukel Edem mukel paripnahal Ani penjas ajdevle eha. I guess it was my
And so here are the lyrics to that uh, to that song, which again is quite well known. I won't read the lyrics because they're on the screen. Um, oh, here's a better, if you want to screenshot it, here's a better slide of the lyrics. One of the lines that is sort of taken up as one of the most powerful lines is the second um, uh, line after the line break. Oh, blackbird, carry my letter, carry it to my woman. I am sitting in Auschwitz. And the way that I've written about and other people have talked about this line is that it is about the sort of transmission of memory of the Holocaust, right? This idea of, of contextualizing a traumatic experience in a letter and then having a messenger, in this case, a blackbird, carrying it outside of the concentration camp is a very powerful image that has this kind of metaphoric level to it. And it really dovetails with this quote from Ruzenia Danielova, who is also a Romani Holocaust survivor who brought this same song out from Auschwitz. And the quote on your screen is from an event where she sings the song and then she says this. This is a quote from her from that event. I must tell you, dear guests, why I want to sing this song, so that it'll be known to the public in the world. I was locked away in Auschwitz for 2 years, and this song, when I was getting the most blows, my flesh was falling from my knees, from my elbows the same. The small of my back is damaged even today. During these greatest blows, I composed this song, which I will sing for you. I'm not sure if I can sing it all the way through, or if I won't start to weep. Again, so this transmission of Romani memory through song, through oral transmission is really clear in that quote. Um, I want to play an example from Romania. This is Alexandrina Radu, who I had a Holocaust survivor who was victim of the deportations to Transnistria in Romania during World War II. She's a Holocaust survivor who I had the great honor of meeting. I'm going to, if I have time, come back to this, but the song that I would like to play for you from the Romanian uh, territory is a song called Song from Transnistria, Cântec din Transnistria, Te rog, domnul Antonescu, which is a song that I found in in the Institute of Folklore and Ethnography in Bucharest, the Constantin Breloiu archives. And in you can see the catalog on the right side of the screen, and about 3/4 of the way down, there's the entry, in parentheses, din Transnistria te rog, Domnul Antonescu. So this song was recorded in December 31st of 1960 um, by three collectors at the Institute of Folklore and Ethnography. It was recorded in Tsundere, and the information in the catalog says that this was a 26-year-old Romani man, and that his name was Nicolae Paun. And he sings this song about the deportations of Roma to Transnistria. The lyrics that you have translated are in a mix of Romanes and Romanian. It's mostly Romanian with a little bit of Romanes sprinkled in. Um, the thing that I want to highlight about this before playing it for you is how hidden this song has been since 1960, that it does not circulate, that nobody knew that it existed, and that I had to comb through a entirely handwritten catalog in order to find it, and it would have been really easy for me to miss. And I think that hiddenness of this song is a kind of metonymy of very representative of how the existence of Holocaust memory, that it's so hidden, and it's so gatekept in these archives, or it's lost with the embodied knowledge of survivors who are now past, that we actually don't have access to it. And I think that it's, almost miraculous that I was able to find this one example. Um, and I will play it for you now. I just wanted to really highlight for you just how unique and how important and special this recording is. So let's take a listen.
Cântec din Transnistria, te rog, domnul Antonescu.
Dragă, te rog, Doamne, Antonescu, ai, te rog, Domnul, Antonescu, dragă, mai treci și tu, Logonescu. Dragă, mai treci și tu, dragă, că nu omii sau dragă, tu suzești cu
I'm actually going to put these. So this is the Romanian and Romani, and then the translation of the of the song on the other side. And some things I just want to briefly highlight before moving on are the vocal the sort of vocal placement, the placement of the voice within the body in this is very, very far forward. It's almost in the mouth, which we interpret as sounding kind of nasally. And then you have these minor ninth leaps that the singer enacts, which are not only technically very difficult, but they're also in combination with the placement of the voice, gives it this quality that it's almost mimetic of wailing. in the song. So musically, we can think about how the singer is shaping the melodic line in order to sort of fit the subject matter. In terms of the poetry, it's what some things that are notable and are interesting. One, that the singer refers to Antonescu. Antonescu was Hitler's ally in Romania, and he was the general in charge at the time who ordered the deportation of Jews and Roma in 1942 to Transnistria, which was a region between Moldova and Ukraine, between the Bug and the Dniester rivers. That's why it's called Transnistria. And this is a region that was gifted to Antonescu by Hitler. And that's where one of the largest killing sites in Eastern Europe. It's sometimes referred to as the Romanian Auschwitz. That's the sort of memory that's being contextualized here. What's interesting is that the singer refers to the General Antonescu as with the informal te rog instead of vă rog. So there's this both a sort of kneeling down to power by saying like the sort of begging of the dictator intent on genocide, to put himself in their place, to stand in the place of the people who are being deported. But he is signaling this kind of disrespect right from the beginning with the informal address with Terog. And that kind of foreshadows what happens at the end of the song, where he says, some vulgar things, and says, don't put yourself against me. You don't know what my mouth can do. And then signals this kind of solidarity, this intra-community solidarity. When brothers are next to brothers, the world makes room for you. So it's a very powerful song, but that asks, the dictator to put himself, stand in our place, Mr. Antonescu. And at first, that kind of positioning might seem odd, right? But it's very much in line with something that we do find in the archive, which are these letters that are written to Antonescu, asking for their family to be released from the concentration camp. So this is just one example of one such letter written by a man named Grant Balota, who is asking, he says, with tears in my eyes, and on my knees, I ask you of the following: to liberate my daughter Lenuța and her husband. They worked near my house. They're serious and they have absolutely no guilt. So he's asking Antonescu to release them. And when we put these two things next to each other, this archival document that is written from the perspective of a Romani person, right? But it's written for it's written for an audience that is the dictator, again, intent on genocide. So when we put these two things next to each other, there are elements of Romani resistance, of Romani subjectivity, that come through in the song and the poem that are not intended for the ears or the eyes of the perpetrator. And that's part of what I think is so interesting and valuable about, treating music and song as legitimate kind of historical sources, is that you get these like heretofore unheard dimensions of Romani experience of the Holocaust. I want to kind of move a little bit more quickly, so I'm going to skip this example of a more recent poem written by a woman with Romani heritage, Celia Wolcock, a poem called Tsigan, the Gypsy poem that speaks about the Romani Holocaust. I recently encountered this and I'm not very familiar with it, but it's to Sylvia's Press, published in 2018, and this is just an excerpt from a longer poem. What I do want to spend a little bit of time on, or at least show you is, and give you an opportunity to maybe take a screenshot, is this poem by Papusha. So Papusha is probably the most well-known poet, Romani poet. Her dates are there, 1908 to 1987. And this poem, the song Tears of Blood, or What We Suffered Under the Germans in Volhynia in 43 and 44, that is the title of the poem written in 1952. And what I find really interesting here as a musicologist is that I'll read the very first lines. Oh, my good people, believe me on my love of God, I don't want to remember the bad times because my soul is sick and wants to cry right away. But what can you do? It is necessary to sing to evil people who want war. And I just think that it's so interesting that she names the power of song, right, in the beginning of this poem. And it's something that comes up over and over. Let me see let me see reason for my song so that they do not want war, so that their soul softens, so that they learn what war is. Because there's the ones who said, don't give anything to the Roma, and goes on and on. So this is a longer poem. It's available in many languages, translated. It's easily Googleable, and you can find it, and it's wonderful and highly recommend. Um, I'm going to kind of speed through a little bit of Chaya Stoica's work, who many of you are probably also already familiar with. Chaya Stoica was one of 6 children born to Romani parents who lived in Austria. They're Sinti, and they were from the Lovara community. She was 5 years old when her family's wagon was parked for the winter in a Vienna campground when Germany annexed Austria. Uh, this was in 1938. And in 19 between 1940 and 1944, when Roma were forced to register as members of another race, and her family was one of those families who were eventually deported to a Nazi camp for Roma in Birkenau. And then she was subsequently freed in Bergen-Belsen in 1945. And this is a photograph of her, and we're going to look at some of her paintings. So she's a very prolific artist who documented both memory before the war, paintings that document sort of Romani life before, pre-war, the period of internment, as well as life after the war in over 1,000 images. Here's an example of a sort of a war image, one of her paintings depicting the period of her imprisonment in concentration camps, Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Bergen-Belsen. And here, we see what art historians would call the common iconography typical of immediate post-war art. So these images of the camps of bodies, sort of piles of bodies and barbed wire. This is very common iconography in post-war art. This is another example. And here's more of the art from documenting the experience in the camps. And then I wanted to also show you some of her work that doesn't depict internment, but documenting life after the Holocaust. So a recurring motif in her post-war paintings is the motif of the sunflower, which she calls the flower of the Roma, which looks for the sun and represents hope. So this is a recurring motif along with the Virgin Mary that you see in the corner, the lower corner. Um, and Chaya Stoica would claim that, you know, she's grateful to the Virgin Mary for having survived. And here's another example of the sunflowers that she paints. She's famously quoted Chaya Stoica for this quote, I'm afraid that Europe is forgetting its past and that Auschwitz is only sleeping. Anti-Gypsyist threats, police policies and actions worry me greatly and make me very sad. So she said this, and it sort of, um, you know, prefigured a lot of this rising Romani racism in Europe today. So this I'm using as a kind of segue to just briefly touch on some of that. This is one of her later paintings that again has the barbed wire and these piles of bodies that again are part of this iconography. But I want to show just briefly some of these slides that get us into something I was talking about at the beginning, the way in which this trauma, this historical trauma is not historical, right? But that it's temporally unbound and continues to affect Roma today. You know, these are just some examples of headlines that you see about Romani refugees experiencing discrimination during the war, the famous case of a Romani man who was knelt on by a Czech police officer who was, you know, talked about as the kind of Czech Romani George Floyd. This is graffiti that I took photos of in Bucharest. Moartea ciorilor means death to the crows. Crows is a pejorative term for Roma. And then this interview with a politician who's part of the rising national party, far-right party in Romania, Sorin Lavric, in 2020, who intones language towards the Roma that is very reminiscent of how the Nazis and their allies talked about Roma. So he says, I was saying that gypsies are a social plague. This does not mean that everyone is a social plague, but we know very well statistically, if we are honest, what inclination this ethnic group has towards certain crimes. And so you, as people who are familiar with the discourse and way that Roma were stereotyped and persecuted during the Holocaust as criminals, as vagrants, as asocials, understand the implications of saying that Roma are a social plague. So to kind of wrap up, I think one of the main takeaways from, you know, this presentation is that this historical kind of amnesia, the lack of recognition of historical trauma surrounding Romani experiences of the Holocaust directly informs contemporary society's inability to comprehend that historical persecution is directly tied to present day racism and discrimination. You know, it's more common when we think about when US scholars talk about this kind of through line within the African American community between centuries of enslavement, Jim Crow laws, lynching, ongoing systemic and structural racism, oppression, mass incarceration, and the way that these kind of historical realities affect many generations. But when it comes to Roma, we don't have that same kind of common understanding at a broader kind of societal level. I think that in European society today, on an academic level, there is more scholarship and more work being done to trace that through line. We have people like Adrian Nicu Fortuna and Magda Matake who are talking about how these historical traumas have had a real material impact on the lives of Roma. Um, And I think that, it's probably very common at this point to say this, but it's only through understanding, what had once made Romani life vulnerable to ethno-racial murder. It's only through understanding the logics and um, the the sort of epistemological underpinnings of genocide that have claimed the lives of Roma in the past. It's only through understanding them in the past that we can attempt to avoid the same thing happening in the present, especially in the face of this rising hyper-nationalism and this rising neo-Nazism that we are seeing in Europe. Um, so I think I will cut myself off there to leave at least a little bit of time for your questions. This was a question that I just wanted to leave you with. What are concrete actions we can take to ensure that Romani memory is taken up into collective memory and into history more broadly within our own communities on a national level and on an international level? And then I had these resources on historical trauma in case anybody was interested in screenshotting that you're welcome to take a look at. So I'll leave those up for a moment. And then just say thank you. And we'll stop sharing my screen and open it up to your questions or comments.